Gail, can you hear me? Hello.
Hey,
Hey, can you hear me?
yes, I can hear you. Oh, excuse me.
You okay?
Yeah, I'm good.
Yeah. Lots of people paranoid right now about sickness for sure. Seeing it drop people like flies or make people afraid to
Yeah.
go anywhere. And I'll say too that this morning is a morning where a lot of people, I guess, are probably waking up, realizing that they've lost an hour of time. You know,
Yes.
and I know I say a lot of people, but maybe it's just me because that's exactly what happened.
No, I definitely had some trouble this morning too.
Yeah. And I wonder too that may be affecting where Marty is right now, because I don't know if he was aware or if Roadmap made him aware or what it is. But I did email him to let him know that we're starting right now and that maybe he's not here because of the time change. Could be.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
But yeah, we're here. And then also, I guess, just something, because right before I came on, there were all these sirens and a helicopter and all, like, I'm wondering what's going on outside. But I also, as a result of this daylight savings time, especially for this switchover in time, this is apparently the most dangerous day of the year to be on the road.
Oh.
Because so many people will have 1 hour less of sleep who are on the road, and that's, I've seen this statistic a number of places before where the day that daylight savings changes, to lose an hour, there is a spike in traffic accidents, and, all other things being equal, it's likely because people aren't getting the sleep that they need, and that can have a direct effect on your driving performance for sure.
It's very interesting. I'll have to be careful going home.
Yeah. I've just a recommendation there. Yet another thing to be anxious and
Yeah. One more thing.
Yet another thing, because as if we don't have enough already. All right, so let me see here. I want to make sure, because we're going to talk through, obviously, notes on everyone's material. But there is a new kind of concept that I want to talk about today at the beginning, just like we do with the other sessions. But what I would like to do as well is just to do a brief recap. And yes, I know we go over this again and again, but there's a point to go over it again and again so it sinks in, so that it's not just you hear someone talk about it once and then that's it. Like, I want you to see these concepts applied over and over and over till they become basically second nature. But what I want to do is, I'm sure that I've mentioned before in this, the value of watching or rewatching the pilot for Glow.
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
So was that something you were able to do?
Yes. Yeah. I actually love the show. So
Great.
yeah,
Great.
I've seen it
but
a
the
couple
pilot
of times.
in particular, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So, because sometimes, people will watch it and they'll be, oh, I hate the show. And it's like, well, that's not the point. It's like, I want to show you something that's going on in the pilot, because it is essentially a half-hour show. And it is something that when you watch future episodes, right, as you know, when you watch the rest of season 1, you watch season 2, you watch season 3, that's quite a big ensemble show, right? Like, we're going back and forth between what all these different characters are doing. Sometimes characters that, generally feel, excuse me, quite supporting, end up having big arcs or their own episodes at a certain point in the show. So, there's that structure of it, but then you go back to the pilot and you see that it is a very focused structure. And I think one of the first things you end up seeing from the pilot, given some of the different concepts that we've talked about so far, is and sorry, I'm looking down, but I'm just making sure that I'm seeing on my phone to see if I get like an email from Marty or from someone else, given the time change. Like this just kind of threw me off a little bit, just as a FYI. But that first pilot episode is very, very focused on Alison Brie's character, right? It's all from her perspective. Every single scene, she is in the driver's seat, right? The spotlight is on her. It's not on someone else. There's only one scene in that pilot that is from the perspective of another character. And even in that scene, she is central to it, and they're watching her, right? So near the very end of the pilot, you see Mark Maron's character, the director, right? Like looking down and having this vision of what the show could be because he's seeing her and Betty Gilpin's character fight it out, right? So see, even that one scene where another character's point of view gets a spotlight, she is front and center within that scene. And I'll compare that very quickly to what we get out of Breaking Bad. You know, that's another show where, you know, it's an hour, very different tone of a show. But what you see in that show, just like in Glow, is it's quite an ensemble. There are a lot of characters in there who in later episodes and later seasons get very, very strong focus, and the spotlight will definitely be on them at times. But that pilot episode is very firmly focused on Walter White. He is in every single scene and driving every single scene, except for one scene over halfway through the episode where we see his wife and her sister talking with one another. He's not there. But the subject of what they're talking about is Walter. And he walks into the scene halfway into their conversation. So we never lose sight of him, right? So that's like one of the first things to kind of take note of there. And it ends up being a very helpful thing, I think, for especially emerging writers to really focus in on their point of view of their pilot, because so many people, I think, are used to watching mid-season episodes of long-running shows that they expand their point of view kind of all over the place, and they go back and forth between this and this and this. And it unfortunately becomes very confusing, especially on the page to read, because at least when something is filmed, we have an immediate kind of view as the audience on, okay, that's this person, and I remember seeing this person doing that. But when it's on the page, names are very abstract and more difficult to keep track of, you know? So these are just reasons that, and this applies as well to a feature, you know? So even if you're not writing a pilot here, or you're not writing pilots generally, these concepts, I strongly believe, apply to that feature space as well, because I will see people writing features in the format or the structure of a long-running episode, or an episode of a long-running show, you know, like some mid-season episode of a long-running show, and the structure just does not end up working. So what I'm going to do is just to run through quickly the structure of Glow to show you how, and we can discuss it too, to show how nicely it lines up with the concepts that we've talked about so far. So I'm going to share this screen. You have certainly seen this image before, right? This is a character arc thing that we talked about before. And, you know, let's just start with this, right? Because, you know, hopefully this is also something that's being recorded so Marty can see it when he comes back. So in the limited awareness phase, when, you know, like what we've said before with, you know, Star Wars and Wizard of Oz and any of those other, you know, the other movies that we talked about, her version, Alison Brie's character's version of kind of living on the farm, and wanting to do something, because this is important. They're in a normal world and they also want something. All your characters that are going to feel very three-dimensional, they can't just be reacting to the inciting incident that is thrown their way. They need to want something, like, because every one of us as human beings has some sort of desire, even if that desire is to avoid things. There is a clear desire that people will have. So in her limited awareness, in her ordinary world, Alison Brie in Glow, she is a struggling actress, which inherently means she is struggling to get this thing that she wants. And what does she desperately want, right? She wants to be a serious actress, right? Like she's so driven by this. We know this from the very first minute of that pilot, right? From the very first minute, we know what her world is, what she wants to do. We know how much of a struggle it is, you know, and it is barren. I've seen like a desert, right? I have seen plenty of actors in my time out here. It is a difficult profession. It is very demeaning at times, and no matter how much work you put into it, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get success from it, right? So it's kind of like living in a metaphorical desert where you're always thirsty, right? She's thirsty for this, you know, she wants to achieve this, this goal. So the increased awareness comes, right? It's the version of it's the tornado. It's the thing that knocks on the door. It's the message of like, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope. You know, what is that sort of increased awareness thing for her? What will we say is her inciting incident in that pilot? The thing that kind of throws her world out of balance and basically is saying, hey, you're going to have to come deal with this.
Is it when she's doing the audition and she realizes that it's wrestling?
So close, but you know, recall from the pilot that what's happening there. We get that very first scene where she's reading the wrong part, right, on purpose. We find out, and then when it becomes clear that she's not going to get the part, where does she go? She's in the ladies' room, and she runs into, and she's like, she comes face to face with the casting director, right? And she asks the casting director, what's wrong? I'm trying everything, like all these things. And the casting director, it's at that point that she gives her this mission. She knocks on the door, basically. She says, I've got this job you can try out. It's very non-traditional, you know? And so it's not yet that she knows it's exactly what this is going to entail, right? But she knows it's outside the bounds. She's pretty sure it's not porn, right? But it's definitely different than what she's done before. It's something that, yes, is throwing her world out of balance. And we see a couple things happen at that time, right? Because the casting director is giving her this opportunity, but at the same time, the casting director says to her, you are the person that I bring in to show the director what he doesn't want, right? Which is the last thing that any actor wants to hear, right? That's devastating. That's awful, right? And I think that's like basically the most clear kind of inciting incident there that happens for her kind of outer journey. This thing where she gets increased awareness about where she actually stands relative to this goal that she definitely wants. She doesn't realize that she, at the beginning, how kind of far behind the ball she is. She's kind of deluded herself a little bit, because you have to be a little, positively deluded about what you're doing to stay on this sort of path. And look, I want to make it clear, if any actors for some reason end up watching this at some point, is like, you have to keep that about you, and it can work for people, but it can be very difficult. So she gets that opportunity, but she doesn't just immediately say, okay, great, I'm going to go do it, right? Like, we see her very reluctant to go out and do this thing. She refuses that call, that knock on the door. She doesn't want to open the door because, is this serious acting? I don't know. This feels kind of weird. This is odd. She's not ready to do it. even though what other option does she have, right? Because then we go into seeing a bit more of her regular life. And in her regular life, we've got all these people that are kind of telling her, maybe it's time to think about doing something else, right? You've done this long enough. We see it happening in terms of, and this is where we're getting to the overcoming, right? Because what does overcoming refer to? It refers to overcoming your reluctance, right? And your reluctance to change, right, is a reluctance to take on this increased awareness, right? Your reluctance to open the door and answer the call, right? And the call is the thing that directly affects your limited awareness. It increases your awareness, right? It shows you that this ordinary world has some cracks to it. I'm pointing this out because a thing to keep in mind with all of these concepts is they all have to build on one another, right? One builds into the next, builds into the next. And they're all deeply interconnected along a central spine. Like this line that's right here is not just for the convenience of like, oh, cool, let's have some sort of line here that's easy to let us see all this. Think of this line as the spine of the story, the through line, and every one of these ties directly into that line and builds that line in sort of a forward momentum. Like I'll often see when people become familiar with these concepts, or even when they're not familiar with these concepts, what they'll do to advance the story is they'll throw in events. You know, it's like, oh, I need something to happen here. Let's have an event come in. Let's have another event come in. But they're not building off one another and deeply connected to one another and pushing this story forward along this sort of really central spine. Okay, this central spine has a curvature to it according to the character arc, but as you'll see in what we'll talk about today, there's a way you can see it in sort of a straight line too. Anyway, the things that help Alison Brie's character overcome her reluctance, there are a number of them, right? It's realizing she doesn't have any money and she's gonna have to give up on this. You know, she's asking her parents for help again, but they're kind of at the edge. They're kind of at the end of being willing to do that. She's asking her best friend about what she should do, what's going on here. And her best friend at the most is giving her this advice about moving on, doing something else, right? So it's all these things that for her, actually, I think, like they're telling her to try something else. And they're basically saying, give up acting. Right? But she kind of, whether it's a reverse psychology thing or whether she is interpreting the way that she wants to, she interprets this as, you know, maybe I should go try this one last opportunity. What do I have to lose? Because it seems like it's this or nothing else. I have no other options. So it's all these things kind of tied together, get her to overcome her reluctance to take on that weird audition. And she goes out and enters this, she enters this new world. And we can very clearly see that we're entering a new world in this pilot. It's very nicely done, I think, where she enters that gym and she is crossing a threshold, because crossing a threshold is, you know, where is a threshold? It's at the base of a door, right? So she's opening a door to go into something very different than what she's done before. And certainly walking into a gym that has a wrestling ring in the middle of it and is full of, you know, very odd people sitting in the bleachers, that is new. That's like her going down the yellow brick road. That's like her entering that cantina in Star Wars, right? Where everything is very different than what we've dealt with before. So she's committed to taking on this call to awareness or this call to adventure or inciting incident, whatever it is. She's overcome the reluctance that she had, and she is committed to at least trying this thing out, right? So when she commits, what do we say happens in this sort of experimenting phase? Remember, this is tests, allies, and enemies. And she's experimenting with this new world that she's entering. We're learning things about her. We're learning things about the people that are now around her, the things that she's going to have to deal with. What do we see as that sort of thing happening in Glow?
Well, we're seeing her meet everybody. Like, aren't we getting like little snippets of all the other wrestlers' characters? And then,
Absolutely.
yeah, and we have that girl who just walks away or something.
Yep. Like
So, yeah.
there are all sorts of, there's the director, right? Which, because we're thinking tests allies and enemies, right? So some of these people she's meeting are allies. Some of these people are enemies. And we are seeing her being tested throughout some of this, right? Because this is odd. This is weird. And this is really, there's a lot of fun that happens in this stage of the story, right?
Right.
Especially in a comedy. But it also lets us know more about who she actually is, because she can tell us at the beginning all she wants to about who she thinks she is, right? And often I see people try to do this in the things that they're writing, is they're trying to have the protagonists themselves tell us who they think they are, or the characters around them tell us, the audience, who they think the character is. But the real magic comes from the character revealing their true self in the way that they act. That's how we truly get to know a character, right? Because someone can tell you all they want. Oh, I'm very brave. I'm always willing to help people. But then it's not until something terrible happens to something right next to them that we learn, are they actually brave or not, right? Through their actions. So that's what we're figuring out in this sort of experimenting stage, is how is she reacting to this whole wrestling thing? And what do we start to see from her? I mean, I'll just tell you what I think is, I think we see from her, at least at this stage in the story, she feels like she's above all of this. She feels like she's better than these people, that she doesn't belong here, right? That she's going to have to do this because she has no other choice at the point, but she's better than this, right? So that's something
Isn't she
that's
mocking a little bit.
What's that?
Doesn't she start mocking it a little bit? Or
yeah, I think that's
okay.
and that's a perfect illustration of that sort of thing. She's mocking it. She doesn't take it seriously. And some of these people, that's all they've ever wanted, is to be part of something like this, you know? But we learn about her and who she is. And I'll say, notice something here too, is that in this area, we're meeting a lot of characters, but only very briefly, right? They never steal the spotlight from Alison Brie's character. In future episodes, they get a lot of screen time in their own storylines, but not right here. Right. Like, there are some people who have massive arcs that we just get a brief, really quick kind of thing from them in this pilot, and particularly in this section, because that's all you're really going to have time to do in the amount of time that you have if you're writing a pilot, right? You don't have time to give the story over to dozens of different people and still have it turn out effectively, right? So all of this, though, this experimenting, test allies and enemies, like she's crossed the threshold, she's in this new world. They're trying to do something. They're getting ready for something. They're preparing. They're approaching. And we get this sort of feeling that, yes, they are getting ready to face something. What would you say that is in this pilot?
Well, face where they're going to do this glow thing, that they're going to be part of it.
Well, yeah, I think that kind of the very end of that is where you're getting to that, right? They essentially have to audition. Yeah. They have to choreograph a fight with one another and audition for it.
Right.
But the key there is that they are getting, like, we, the audience, can feel that they're pushing closer to this thing they're going to have to do. They are approaching, there's this pull, right? It's the same thing we get in Wizard of Oz. We're getting closer to the wizard. We're approaching this thing that we need to do in the Emerald City. In Star Wars, we are approaching the Death Star. Like, there's this sense of dread and anticipation and possibly excitement as we're getting closer and closer to facing this very dangerous thing, right? And so for them in this, it's that audition where they're gonna have to fight, right? But we have that feeling, and that's something this is another point where I see people kind of dropping the tension in their stories, or kind of just completely ignoring that this is something we need to feel. We have to feel that pull towards this thing, and there has to be some sort of, like, the same way that the reluctance to change makes the overcoming and committing feel important. You know, it's kind of setting out the stakes of what this real kind of jumping over the hurdle means. Like, it shows how difficult it is to jump over the hurdle. This is doing something similar by making this feel more important. It's making us a little fearful of this. We get anxiety about this approaching, right? We need to have that feeling so that this becomes a truly big, momentous moment, right? It helps prepare the way for it. And what would we say, you know, because we get to the midpoint of the pilot, and I think there's a very clear midpoint here. Remember, midpoint is also about, like, you know, facing death, you know, metaphorical death, really. You know, the biggest fear that people are going to have to face is going to come right in here. This is the big thing that they have to deal with, that they're going to fall flat on their face with. What would we say that is for her character in Glow?
Is that where she fails? She doesn't.
Exactly.
Yeah, she doesn't do well at all.
Exactly.
And then she has to reassess her entire life, including the relationship she's having. Correct. And everything.
So think about that. Like, if, you know, if we're thinking of a low point in this pilot, the lowest point, I don't think it gets much lower than, you know, she realizes she has run out of options with her standard acting pursuit. So she, you know, goes out on a limb to try this one last opportunity. And if she doesn't get this one last opportunity, she's essentially going to have to run back home, which means giving up the dream that she's lived for probably over a decade at that point, right? Mm. And then, yeah, she loses that audition. She gets cut. And it's devastating. It's like you feel like, whoa, your heart kind of drops into your stomach. You're like, where does this go? Where can it go from here? It's that similar feeling that you get when you realize the wizard isn't there to help you. The wizard is this big scary thing that's like not going, it's not the savior you thought it was going to be, right? Or in Star Wars when Obi-Wan Kenobi dies, right? It like kind of drops everything out from under you. And you're like, where can we possibly go from here? She gets that moment, and then to compound it, to make it feel even worse, she gets her food stolen from her by a gang of like, or not a gang, but like a group of, group of skateboarding kids, right? And it's just, it feels terrible, right? So that terrible thing happens, but that can't be the end of the story. It has to propel us into the next phase, right? Which is, what can she learn from this? Because it's either she goes back home and gives everything up, and when I say home, I mean leaving LA, or she learns from this, from falling down. And I think she does end up learning from falling down, right? Because she decides that, you know, there's something that she learns that I think we've kind of talked about a little loosely in, as we talked previously about this, is she wasn't taking it seriously. She thought she was above it. She thought that she didn't have to do any sort of like research on it or care about it. Like, she essentially realizes, I think, that she was a bit arrogant about this. And maybe that informs other things that she's doing in her life. And that's sort of what I think the consequences are, the reward is. The reward ultimately, I think, is knowledge about how you could do something differently, how you could do something better, how you could give yourself one last shot given this new knowledge that you have, right? So she takes these consequences.
Is it also, I'm sorry, is it also her ego? Because now her ego is just kind of blown up in her face. And because she had that arrogance, it didn't work for her. And she's seeing that nothing worked in her whole life. Nothing is working. And she's kind of dialing her ego back a little bit.
Absolutely. She reassesses. And for her, it's that very specific, like, ego, arrogance, or, you know, thinking she's above it all, whatever it may be, right? But it all kind of, I think, feeds into itself, right? But think about how that can apply to other stories too, right? The basic thing that's happening here is the character has fallen down, something terrible has happened to them, because previously they held on to this flawed view of how to interact with the world. But since they fall down, they have to reassess everything that they had done before. And if they do truly reassess it and learn what the mistakes are that they had been making, this gives them a new possibility. They finally truly have a new possibility, right? Because the call to adventure was trying to give them a new possibility, but at that point, they were still holding on to this flawed view of themselves, their ego, as you would say, right? Their flawed ego kind of armor that they'd put on, right? But this consequences, that's really what's happening here. What do we learn from the big change that we can then try to put to use if we rededicate ourselves? If we try to go back and do it one last time? Like, what if we get one last opportunity to do that? And I think we very clearly see that in Glow, right? She decides that she's going to try to go back and win that audition, but in order to do it, she's not going to just go back and do exactly what she's done before. She sits down and, well, sits down at first, but then starts jumping around with it, right? Like the whole, like, taking wrestling seriously. You know, she does the research. She takes it for what it is. She starts to create her version of a character or whatever based off of what she feels like she's learning from that. Like, she's opening herself up finally in a true way, right? So she rededicates and goes back for one final attempt. And it's a very cringe-worthy kind of moment there, right? Where she comes in and it's like, oh God, what is she doing? It's like we feel embarrassed for her, right? But that sort of cringe is closely related to the type of feeling we should always get in this final attempt, which is, oh no, this might not work. Even though they're trying this new thing, like, it's scary to try something new, right? Like, if and I'm sure you've been in this situation before, we've all been in this situation before, where we go outside of our comfort zone to try something new. It's that whole feeling of going out on a limb and being very nervous. Like, is this going to work? I don't know, but I have to try it. I have to do it. That's this kind of general underlying feeling we should get here, however on the surface that expresses itself. She makes this final attempt with this new character and this new view that she has, but it's not quite going according to plan. It doesn't quite feel like it's working, right? Like, something just isn't working there until her friend bursts through the door. Her friend bursts through the door, and we see her inner and outer life colliding, and a real fight ensues. Now, this is where, you know, if she hadn't gone through the things that we saw before, this moment never would have happened. So she's still responsible for bringing this moment together. And in this moment, she stops acting. She's truly in the moment, because that's yet another thing that maybe she hasn't learned yet how to do, but we're able to tap into this because she's willing to open up a little bit more about things. And because, like, really strong acting, usually you don't feel like the actor is acting, right? Like, if you watch a lot of performances, you can tell when someone is trying and when someone is just, like, literally in the moment reacting to it. You know, if you're not used to watching a lot of acting performances, it's hard to describe or kind of put your finger on, but you know it. It's the same way that you know when someone's lying to you, right? When someone's lying to you, you can just, like, you can feel it. You know, you feel that something is off in how all of this is being presented. But when they truly believe it, when they're truly reacting, or when they're really good liars, you can't tell. And so in that moment, you can't tell, or, you know what I mean? Like, it feels real. It doesn't feel like acting. And that's how she ends up attaining mastery, right? She gets what she wanted from the very beginning. A job in this sort of, like, acting profession, or at least adjacent to it in wrestling, right? She wins. There is a full feeling of satisfaction that happens here, because the thing she set out to do, she did it. Right. But, and this is where I think Glow is really brilliant in how it structures it, is as she gets the very thing she wanted, a number of other things in her life fall apart, right? Like, especially this relationship with a friend, like essentially getting what she wants opens up a whole new can of worms that leads us into needing to come back to see how it's going to turn out in future episodes.
Right.
And I think there are really two things that we want to come back to see in future episodes, right? It's how is this going to resolve itself, this issue with the friend that we've come to care about? And then two, how, what's going to happen with this whole wrestling thing overall? Like, where's the fun in that? Like, it's a positive pull, and then there's the negative pull of like, how is this friendship going to come back together, right? So I bring this up because a lot of times people will create their pilots or their first installment of a feature franchise and just have it be pure setup, where it's like, we're just setting up things that are then going to pay off in future episodes. And if you want to know how they're going to have to pay off, boom, I've ended the pilot. You're going to have to come back and see more. That is incredibly dissatisfying, though, when you sit down and want to watch a story. So what you need to give us is a fully resolving story like this pilot does, you know, even if it doesn't end on a fully positive note. And a lot of stories won't, because they need you to come back for more, right? You get some of what you want, yes, but then if you want to see how the rest of it's going to come back together and get, you know, nicely resolved, you're going to have to come back and see more, right? So it's this kind of mixed ending that this has. But yeah, I think that's the basic sort of structure of Glow. And, you know, it goes through all 12 of these steps in only about a half hour, right? It's a little longer than a half hour, I think, because we get that, we get the, that fight sequence that extends it out a little bit. And, you know, you have to let certain things kind of, you know, play out and breathe certain scenes. But if you go back and look at the actual written pilot for Glow, it is only just above 30 pages, right? So it's 30 minutes essentially where we deliver on every one of these things, you know? All right, so any questions on that at this stage?
Well, her character, for me, I find her character a little unlikable. In you know, she's pushy, and there's something about her that kind of rubs me the wrong way. So at the end, when they have that fight and she gets her butt kicked, that feels like a satisfying conclusion to that whole storyline.
Yep.
So is it so her inner story, that's just kind of the jumping off point for the whole series. Is it necessary to have that conclusion in the pilot and then move on from there, or do you want to kind of stretch that out a little bit?
What do you mean? Her inner story
I mean, like the relationship that she's having the affair and everything. So do you want to end that in the pilot, or is that just the jumping off point? Like, could it have gone
Well,
on?
I think it's a little bit of both. I personally think that because I'll say the outer story, the thing she's trying to do is clearly getting the job. But the more inner story that she's dealing with is how she views herself and how she kind of takes that out basically on her friend, like cheating on her friend with her friend's husband, right? And I think what happens there at the end of that inner story is both a resolution, but also opening up a new can of worms, right? Because there's a resolution in the fact that, like, when we first realize in the pilot earlier on that this affair is going on, we know at some point that other shoe is going to have to drop. There's going to have to be some resolution to this lie that she's actively keeping up. So at the end, we do get resolution because she finds out, they get in a fight, but the result of that fight is the friendship falls apart, right? So there is a resolution to that, but that resolution opens up a whole new set of problems. Because what was earlier happening is she going to find out, I feel guilty about this, she should know, this should end. It's like, what's going to happen there? How is that sort of, all those open threads, how are they going to resolve themselves? Well, they resolve themselves by her friend finding out, and it starts a fight. And that fight makes the friendship fall apart. So if we want to see the friendship possibly come back together, we have to come back to find out what's next.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. But I
all
wonder,
of this is open to interpretation.
Right.
You know?
So would the pilot have been stronger if they didn't resolve that, if they left that kind of unresolved for the next episode?
I don't think so. No, I don't think so. I could be wrong, but I think I just want to be clear. I think they did. There is a resolution to that, right? And I think what you may be talking about is like to resolution, or no, you're saying if the fight didn't happen until the next episode. I don't know about that, because I think it's that fight that really kicks off the need to come back to see how it's going to resolve itself. Because otherwise it's just, okay, she got the job, you know, and there's this lie that's in the background. I think it's more powerful to have that explode in the end. And then we're like, where is this going to go from here? You know, like it really gives you the impetus to need to come back. But again, that's just my personal opinion. And all I can give you on that sort of thing is my personal opinion, you know, because and a lot of things would have turned out differently, I think, if they hadn't had the fight, because if you think about it and you know that you've watched like future episodes, even though she came back with new knowledge, she didn't really get it right. Even there, she was overacting. She wasn't doing it quite well. It wasn't until she was put in a truly damaging moment with her friend that she was able to tap into real, true acting, you know? And if she didn't have that fight, would she have ever gotten that job and that resolution there? I don't know.
Okay.
But yeah, that's kind of, you know, something definitely more to think about, and ask yourself your own questions about it too as well. But that's just a review of that. So I want to stop this share, and I want to go to the next sort of like, what are we really kind of focused on this week as the new concept to cover. And just a brief preview of that new concept to cover is this. It's so far we've seen things that happen in a very circular kind of way that come and resolve themselves. This thing that we're going to look at today is much more of a straight line that's going through. So I've said before, all these things are maps, different maps of the same territory. And I hope you will end up seeing by the end of this today that even though this is a new map that looks very different than what we've seen before, it's dealing with basically the exact same type of material. It's a new concept as well within it that we can apply to all of our work, but it deals with this through line that you could either curve around or have it be kind of very straight, right? So the basic idea is this, we're talking about the gap in progression. The gap in progression. You could also call this the defiance of expectations, right? And to leap off of the defiance of expectations kind of idea, I'm sure you, and if Marty's listening to this at some point, have heard in the past people who say, well, when you ask them what do they want, they'll often tell writers, give me the unexpected. I want the unexpected. I want to have my expectations, I want something that I don't see coming. And most people, when they hear that, especially writers, before they kind of really understand this concept, most of us will say like, well, I don't know what you can predict. I don't know what the hell you expect. You're telling me to give you the unexpected. Well, what do you expect? So that I know how to write opposite to that. But that's really not what they're getting at when they say that. What you need to keep in mind is that you, as the writer, create the expectations in your story and in every single scene. You set us up to think that something's going to turn out one way, right? That set us up to think that this is going to happen or that this is going to happen. So if you're in control, which you are, because the story doesn't exist without the words that you're writing. If you can set up our expectations, then you can just as easily make the scene go in a direction that we don't expect it to go. You set us up to think it's going to go this way, but then you take this sharp left turn, or I know I'm going right when I'm saying this, but you take this sharp turn in the other direction. Also think of it as like, you have set the table with the tablecloth underneath it, and then you pull the tablecloth out from under us. Or the same sort of like you show us this very nice rug, and you say, hey, come and stand on this rug that I've created, and then you pull the rug out from under us. It's that sort of feeling where I don't know where this is going to go. And if we get that feeling of, I think the scene's going here, but then it goes this way, I don't know what to expect, it feels somewhat unpredictable, we lean in because we want to know, like we have to know how this is going to resolve itself, and we're on the edge of our seat not knowing how this is going to turn out. We know it has to achieve certain things, but we don't know how they're going to play out, and that makes stories really fascinating to watch, fascinating to read, fascinating to listen to. Like in a lot of ancient cultures, poetry, for example, everyone knew how the stories were going to turn out, right? They knew it's spoilers. Nobody cared about spoilers. They knew how stories were going to turn out, what the results were going to be, but it was how we got to those results where people could build in unpredictability, right? So that's why as well, like, we complain nowadays about, oh, they make so many remakes and there's so many remakes of all these different movies. Well, for thousands of years when cultures were telling oral poetry, what do you think they were doing? They were telling slightly different versions of the same exact stories over and over and over. There's nothing new that's happening there, right? But it's how we get there that matters. It's how we get there that makes us, really tune in and pay attention, or look at our watch, look at our phone, or, turn it off to go do something else, go out and, if you're at the movie theater, I'm going to take my bathroom break now because I know I'm not going to miss anything. What you want is this feeling in the audience's mind or the reader's mind when they're reading your script. I can't look away from this. If I look away from this, I will miss something. And you get that by continually playing with our expectations, setting us up to think it's going to go this way and then going that way, right? We may still get to a resolution that we somehow kind of expect in our minds, but how we get there is more important, right? So this is where the gap in progression concept comes into play, the defiance of expectation. Because basically what you do is this. I want to give you a basic introduction before I share with you this image, because this image is not pretty, as I'll explain, and you'll see very quickly. But the basic idea is this, right? You have a character who has a goal, right? Maybe they have a goal in a scene, and they also have a goal in the overall story, right? Every scene, a character is driven to get a goal. Like, I have to convince someone of this, or I have to stop this sort of thing from happening, or I have to get out the door, or whatever it may be. I have to escape from this. Like, each scene is driven by the character's goal. The character's in the driver's seat and is trying to reach a destination. But the overall movie is also driven by a goal. The overall pilot is driven by a goal that ties it all together, that they're trying to pursue. So character wants to get this. Think of this as the object of desire, the thing that they want. Character wants to get this by the end of this journey. So most characters, right, when they start out, will they think they know how they're going to get this. They have a plan to get this. So they take an action to get this goal, but then the rug is pulled out from under them, right? And what they thought was going to get them their goal actually only gets them here, or they get pushed back even further here. Something comes in to keep them from getting their goal, or they don't realize that what they thought was going to be enough to get to this point isn't. So whatever it is, we think it's going to go this way, but it ends up, boom, they get pushed back here. And a gap opens up between what we expected was going to happen, that they were going to get their goal, and what they actually get, which is only right here. There's a gap in here. And this is the important thing, because when this gap opens up, like you think you're going to go here, but then you only go to this point, this space in here is unpredictability, right? It's like, how are we going to get to this point? We still need to get this. We want them to get this. We thought it would be that what they were doing, by all fairness, they should have gotten here, but they only get here. So what are they going to do? That is what keeps things unpredictable. That's what keeps people on the edge of their seat wondering, well, now what's going to happen? Now what can we possibly do? I wanted them to get this. Did you see Mission Impossible 5 by any chance?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Now, I'm not saying it's the best movie in the world, but if you want to see a great example of a recent film in which this concept is used, look at the action sequences in that movie, right? The rest of the movie is very poorly structured. The dialogue is awful, but the action sequences are top notch because what they do, just very briefly, right, is we have this goal, maybe it's impossible, whatever it may be in each scene or in this action sequence that we have to get. We come up with a plan and we know that, okay, if we just execute A, B, and C, we're going to get to this thing that we want. And what inevitably happens when they start the plan? The plan goes to shit. Now what are we going to do? Well, we have to improvise. So we have to figure out a new way to do this. We know what the goal is and we know what they're trying to do, but we don't know how they're going to accomplish it. And it keeps building off of that, where even the new thing that they try to do, something else comes up that screws it up. So now we have to go even further with improvising. And that really makes those action sequences work incredibly well. And if you really go look at all the reviews for the action sequences of Mission Impossible. They're like, oh, it's the best action movie of all time. I'll say some of the action sequences are incredibly well written. I would not agree that it's the best action movie of all time for so many reasons. But the action sequences play out this concept incredibly well. So I told you I'm going to share with you this diagram. This diagram comes from Robert McKee and his book Story. And I'm sure I've recommended these different books before.
Yeah.
But this diagram just straight from one of the pages, and if you're interested in this concept even further, I highly recommend picking up that book and looking at the sections in which he talks about this, because he spends a lot more pages describing what this is and will probably do a better job than I do today. I'm going to do my best, but there's so much more that you can cover and go back and forth with when it's like written down like that. And I think even more importantly, what he ends up doing is he shows how you can break down iconic scenes with this concept. Hey, Marty. So I don't know if you got my email, but I didn't even realize, I'll be honest, I woke up a little over 10 minutes before this was supposed to start, thinking I had yet another hour until it was supposed to start. I'm like, oh no, the clocks have gone back.
I just saw your email, man. I'm still on this bloody movie set. And I'm kind of like, oh, for fuck's sake.
All good, but we're here now, so no issue. What I will say, Marty, is it probably will be worth your time to go back and look over what we talked about in the first hour. However, though, we're just getting into the meat of the new lesson today. So this is actually a really good time, I think, to come in here.
Thank God.
Yeah, so the main new concept that we're talking about here is the gap in progression. This will make sense, and it might even make even more sense when you go back and look at the other stuff, but we can't go over it twice, but I think we're getting right into where it really matters. So to finish the thought we were in the middle of then there, Robert McKee, in that section in the book, breaks down an iconic scene from Chinatown, and I think he also does this with a scene from Casablanca, and shows how in individual scenes the gap in progression is used over and over and over again to make a very very powerful scene play itself out, one that you cannot look away from. Okay, so this diagram that I'm sharing, it's not pretty. It looks like, ancient stereo instructions that you can't figure up from down, and it's nobody's going to win any design awards from this. But I'm going to break this down for you step by step, and once you have the understanding of how it works, it's very easy to kind of wrap your head around and use, and it can actually be very helpful in the way that it breaks all these little tiny parts of it down. But the basic idea, right, is character has a goal. They do what they think they need to do to achieve that goal, but something gets in the way that pushes them back. And then we are left wondering, well, they haven't given up that goal. How are they going to get it now? Now that this plan didn't work, how are they going to get it? You know? So let's share this screen. Yeah, I think you'll see immediately. It's like really bad IKEA instructions or stereo instructions that this looks like. So do we see this here? This is an ugly diagram, okay? I encourage you not to just rush to write this down. We're gonna walk through this step by step. I wanna make sure that you're not missing this. And if you're trying to, you know, write it down instead of listening and following along, you will miss something important here. This can easily be gotten online too if you don't have the Robert McKee book. I personally got this just off of a Google image search by looking for, I think I put in like Robert McKee gap in progression. Easy to find, it's out there. So anyway, as I said, this, to make the gap in progression work, you basically need at first two important things. You need a character, and that character needs a goal, right? We can call, like, the character obviously would be the protagonist who's trying to do something, trying to get to the goal, which we would refer to as the object of desire, right? So protagonist, goal, how are they going to get to it? Well, look at this. See these arrows here? See where they're all pointing to? This is indicating the character trying to take action to get to this object of desire. So this moves to this. This is trying to move to this. This character has a plan that they're trying to implement to get to this object of desire. It can be an actual plan that they've thought out, like we see in Mission Impossible, but it can also be something that, you know, is a bit more subtle. You know, we all have plans. Like when we wake up in the morning, we expect things are going to go as usual. That, hey, whatever you happen to do in the morning, first thing you have to do is get out of bed probably, right? You know, unless you like sleep standing up or you don't sleep or whatever it is. But like you essentially have to get up. So your goal is, oh, I'm going to get out of bed. But what happens if something comes up to throw that goal off? What happens if, let's say, I don't know, you lost an hour of sleep and you think you've got more time that you can get up to, but you didn't realize that daylight savings was happening in your area today. Like that's an idea of something that kind of pushes you back, something you didn't expect. So now what are you going to do? Now it gets interesting, right? It gets not interesting if a character can very easily get the goal that they want because it's predictable. But when we don't know, like, oh shit, where is this going to go now? That's when story really happens. Story happens in those unpredictable areas. So anyway, character, goal, and the character is going to take an action to get to this goal. You could refer to this as the first action or the plan that they have. But the thing to keep in mind is that all of us will do basically the bare minimum to get what we want. In most of our lives, like we're trying to conserve energy. It's just the way that like human beings and most animals kind of operate, right? It's like we're not going to go really beyond what we think we need to do to get what we want. That would be inefficient. That would be a waste of our energy, a waste of our time. We're going to do we're going to take basically the easy route, the route that we think is going to get us what we want, right? So we take a first action, but that first action, if it gets us what we want, the story's over. You know, the scene is over. It's boring. It's predictable. However, what happens here when we take this first action is something is going to come up to push back on us. And we can see these three things right here: conflict, conflict, conflict. Now, I want to be very clear here that what this is referring to as conflict, don't read the word conflict to mean arguing or yelling or physical fighting. Read it more to mean what frustrates the thing you're trying to do, because that can happen at different layers or different levels of subtlety. It can be very over the top, like in an action movie. Conflict is going to be very in your face and very obvious. But in something that's a bit more dramatic, you know, it is going to be more subtle why you can't get the things that you want, right? So be careful here, because I often, after this session in an incubator, when I tell people to introduce conflict into their stories, it'll come back and suddenly in their stories, everyone's yelling at each other. Everyone's throwing things at the walls and all this. And it's like, that's not quite what we're getting at here. It doesn't have to, it's what frustrates your goal, what pushes you back from your goal. And so what this diagram does is it breaks down those frustrations, those conflicts in 3 different ways. Because a frustration in this sense can come from multiple sources, at once, or maybe just one of these is coming up to push you back. But the first one of these is an inner conflict or an inner frustration. And what this is how do you, as the character, get in your own way? We talked about Glow, and a very clear inner conflict that we're dealing with in Glow is this woman thinks she's above it all. She doesn't think she has to put in the same effort that other people do because she is the better actor, obviously. But that only leads to frustration towards the goal she's trying to get, right? It's an inner conflict. It can be, you're too arrogant about it, or maybe you're too fearful about it, or, whatever it may be. It's something that the frustration comes from something that you are creating inside yourself. You are responsible for it, right? And ultimately, most every problem in anyone's life, when you really break it down, they're responsible for it. So, I know that can sound very harsh, but we can all find ways around things if we're willing to change things up, And I don't mean to get political with that, and I don't mean that as a political statement at all. I just mean if we accept responsibility for our lives in general, there is so much power that we have over where we go and what we try to do. And that's the kind of concept you want to, at times, get across with your stories. So your character is actually in the driver's seat of the story. So inner conflict, inner frustration is one of these things that pushes us back from the goal that we want. Another thing is, as we can see here, personal conflicts. Now, I encourage you to also take a look at this as interpersonal conflicts, right? Because that's really what this is getting at is, okay, maybe the thing that's keeping you from what you want is not just your inner damage or your inner flaw. Maybe it's somebody else pushing you back. Let's say you're trying to get out of the door in the morning and someone calls you on the phone. They're not calling you to fight. Maybe they're calling to sell you something, or maybe they're calling you to inform you about something that's happened. Or maybe somebody, is standing in your way and wants to talk to you. For you, not for you, but remember the movie, have either of you seen Groundhog Day?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay, Groundhog Day, I've seen it many, many times. It's one of my all-time favorite movies. And we know over and over in that movie that inside the town of Punxsutawney, where Bill Murray's character is trying to get to Gobbler's Knob to do his report, he runs into a number of people. He runs into the guy who is asking him for money. He runs into the guy who used to go to high school with him, who's trying to sell him insurance. He runs into a number of people. Those people aren't fighting with him, but they're keeping him from his goal. They're introducing a frustration into the thing that he is trying to do. Those are examples of interpersonal or personal conflicts, right? Personal frustrations. The source that is keeping you from your goal is another person. That's essentially what that is. So it can be you as the inner conflict. It can be someone else in particular that's identifiable as the outer sort of personal conflict or interpersonal conflict. And then the other layer of this is extra personal conflicts. And extra personal conflicts are bigger world events that happen that you can't trace back to one person. That you can't just ask one person, oh, hey, can you stop? Can you let me be on my way, please? Can you leave me alone? Or you can't just knock this one person out if you're getting into a fight with them, right? Think of an extrapersonal conflict as like, okay, your goal as a character is to get to the supermarket in time, or to get to the office in time, and a traffic jam occurs, or you hit a detour, right? You're trying to drive there, you hit a detour, you hit a traffic jam. It's a bigger thing that you can't trace back to one person. It's more of a naturalized disaster sort of event, but it doesn't have to be to the explosive, degree of a naturalized disaster. It's just you can't trace it back to one individual person that is responsible for it. It could be a disaster, like it could be an asteroid heading towards the Earth or something like that. But it's another thing that pushes you back from the thing you're trying to do, and the source of it is not you. It's not an identifiable person. It's more of a bigger world thing that you don't have control over. You hit a pothole. Who are you going to blame the pothole on? You can try to blame it on, oh, well, the city should have done this. But even the city, it's like it's not one person that you can really kind of go and fight with on this sort of thing, right? But notice how all of these conflicts here, or these frustrations, see how the protagonist is trying to move here, like his arrow or her arrow, their arrow is moving this way. The frustration, the conflict pushes us back. Okay, pushes us back. And like I said earlier, character trying to get to the goal, they take action to reach that goal, but something pushes them back, which opens up a gap right here. That's exactly what this is. It's a gap between what we expected we were going to get and what we actually got in the result. We thought, look, every other time that we've tried to do, we've wanted to do this thing or get to this thing, all we've had to do is take this one action. But in this instance, to make it interesting for a story, we try to do this action, and the thing we expected to get is not what we actually get, right? So think about that sort of thing in your scenes, in your overall way that the story progresses, right? Is don't give the character what they expect based on the action that they took. You have to make it difficult for them. You have to make them rise to the occasion. You have to make them jump through hoops and jump over hurdles, right? What they expect and what they get cannot be the same. If it is, it's predictable. That's where true predictability versus unpredictability lies. It's not about spoilers. It's not about, well, obviously the character was going to, like in American Beauty, we know that this guy's going to die at the end of it. Okay, I know the ending, so why do I need to watch the movie? Right? Like, that's stupid. It's how we get there that matters. And we get there in a way that we had no way to expect when we first started watching that movie. So, again, character takes a first action, things push back against that action, opens up a gap, and that's what this little line is supposed to mean, right? This little, like, squiggly line. I'm telling you, this is ugly. This is such an ugly diagram, but it does get everything out there. This is supposed to indicate tension, like story tension. This is where story tension comes from, this gap, because we don't know in that moment, how is this going to resolve itself? How are they going to get what they want? Just like in a Mission Impossible action sequence, now that the plan has gone to shit, how are we going to overcome this? How are we going to get to the result that they need? That's what this tension right here is. So when that first action fails, what do we have to do? If we still want this object of desire, we have to take a second action. And that second action has to be bigger and go beyond what we thought we were capable of in the first action. Otherwise, it's just going to get very repetitive and we're going to keep failing here, right? Second action has to be bigger, has to feel like it's going to push us beyond this conflict that we have. And let's be clear, it has to feel like we're going to push us beyond those conflicts that we had. Doesn't necessarily mean we're going to get what we want, but it has to push us beyond. And note that any time we push beyond what is normal for us, we involve risk. Anytime we do that, anytime we go outside of our comfort zone, this first action was very nicely within our character's comfort zone. This is something they were capable of, something we didn't have to worry about. Obviously, this is going to work, but that second action, when we go above and beyond it, it's risky. It's something we don't know if it's going to work out. This is new territory. I haven't been here before. So we take the second action, but then more frustration, more conflict comes in to push us back and create another gap, right? And then the story frustration comes in again. How are we going to get to this thing? How are we going to get to this object of desire? Well, we need to take a third action and a fourth action. And you see how every time this keeps going, it's not that you take an action and clearly you get what you want. Like, I'll be honest, I read a script recently from someone. I'm not going to say who they are. I don't think either of you would know who they are. But what would unfortunately happen in this is every time a conflict would come up, the character would very easily, oh, here's an explanation for the conflict. I talk to the person that I had the conflict about, I tell them my explanation, and then we resolve the conflict. And that just kept happening over and over. It got repetitive, it got very predictable, and it didn't involve any sort of stakes or risk, because it was like, well, obviously they're just going to easily talk their way out of the next problem that arises. What has to happen is it has to get more and more risky for your character, because what is happening as we keep going here, every time we take another action, we're pushing beyond our comfort zone. And when we get beyond our comfort zone, things get very unpredictable. They can get very scary. They're not safe anymore. So we have to keep pushing this until we get to basically like one of two things. The character either finally gets the thing that they want, or they kind of reach the end of the line of what they're capable of, right? So your character can still fall short of this ultimate thing that they want. You got to be careful about whether you're going to satisfy the audience or not. But maybe by reaching the end of their line here, they learn something about themselves. Like, they've pushed outside of their comfort zone so much that the person they are by the time they get to here is completely different than this safe and kind of insulated person that they were right here. They have pushed beyond to the end of what they're possibly capable of. If you want to finally be nice to your character, this is where you give them what they wanted all along, or some version of what they needed all along, some sort of fulfillment. But you see, all this is about not making it easy for your character to get this thing. And that can happen, that should happen in the overall trajectory of your story. Like, what would happen if all Dorothy had to do to get back to Kansas was, oh, hey, I can just click the heels of my shoes together and then we go back home. Like, there's no story there, right? Like, it's over, right? Or if she just, if the witch of the good witch of the north or whatever it was like, oh, hey, all you have to do is walk back into the house, say these magic words, and then you'll walk out and you're back in Kansas. You'd be like, okay, there's no story here. But what happens in Wizard of Oz? She keeps going to try to get to the Emerald City, and more complications come up. It's not easy for her to get there. More and more frustration and conflict and things come up. Like, it's not always a terrible thing that comes up to push her back. Sometimes it's a fun diversion, right? But we don't make it easy for her in the overall sense to get what she wants to do there. In individual scenes, it should be like that as well. In an individual scene, a character has a goal that they're trying to reach, but they don't get the thing that they want, right? We have to make it difficult in those individual scenes, and sometimes we have to build difficulty upon difficulty. Like I said, when it comes to most very well-written action sequences. If you want to find very well written action sequences in movies, you're going to see this concept again and again and again. But you'll find it in dramatic movies. Like I said, Robert McKee breaks down a great riveting scene from Chinatown in his book that, it's one of those things you definitely weren't tuning out of when you were watching the movie. It's something like, oh my God, this is like, how is this going to resolve itself? But the way that it keeps you engaged is it's gap upon gap upon gap upon gap, over and over and over again. So with your work, with the things that you are writing now that both of you have, your outlines nicely coming together, what you want to be thinking about now is making sure that all of your scenes and all of these sequences that you're going to build are using this concept of the gap in progression. And note that when this gap happens, it often involves some sort of emotional release, right? Some sort of emotional moment is happening here. Because if we've had the rug pulled out from under us and we can't quite predict where this is going to go, we can feel good about that. Like sometimes that's how we'll feel in a joke, because that's essentially what a joke is giving us, right? Is we think that we're going one way, but then the result surprises us, goes another way, and we get a nice positive like sense of laughter from it, right? But it can also be something that's very like drags us down, makes us feel terrible, right? These gaps are accompanied by emotional kind of flourishes. And so if you want to, even though this all runs in one straight line, you could turn this into a circle, and you're getting something very similar to what we had in those previous diagrams, where each one of those key important moments in the hero's journey should be accompanied by the gap. You know, we think things are going to go one way, but then they go another way. And when we delve down into individual scenes, there are multiple gaps that are opening up. So what I really want you to do is filter your work through this concept, find your ways that you're going to build your sequences using this, and make sure that this is used progressively throughout the overall trajectory of your story. And to help you with this, because again, I can explain this in the span of 30 minutes or an hour or whatever it is, but it's never going to compare to actually seeing it play out and understanding and analyzing these concepts for yourself. I want to encourage you both, please, before next session, go and take another look at Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. It's very clearly Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, the third movie in that trilogy. Not the most, or I call it a trilogy, even though there are 4 movies in it now. Not the one with the crystal skull, not the Temple of Doom where they're pulling hearts out of people, you know, and eating monkeys' brains and things, and there's short round and they're going on that roller coaster ride. None of that stuff, or even the first one, not the first one. The first one is quite good, but I really particularly want you to take a look at Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, the one with Sean Connery, right? The one with Sean Connery and the Holy Grail and all that stuff. Take a look at that movie and look for the gap in progression. And I think you're going to see it over and over and over and over again. You know, once you know what's going on here, you'll never look at it quite the same way. You'll look at it in an even better way. You'll be able to analyze it even better, but it will open up new kind of vistas for you. And so doing this, we'll come back next week and talk about just how much that movie uses it from the very first scene. We're not going to talk about the entire movie, you know, and if you're really running low on time, just watch like the first 15 minutes of it. But it's worth watching the entire movie because you'll also see other concepts that we've talked about play out in that movie. And you'll see how all these things can very nicely come together in a way that makes it riveting to watch. And again, to be clear, yes, I'm using an action movie where all this is really over the top. And I know we're not all writing giant action movies. I'm using this as an example because it is very easy to see how this concept is used. But in other genres, you can use it at different degrees of subtlety, okay? So does that make sense? Is that like, do we have any, questions about this at this stage that I can address, that I can answer? It's fine if not, sometimes it takes a little bit for these things to sink in. Okay. All right, so now let's take a look at your individual hero's journey arc and character arc. And let's start with Gail. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop this share on this one, and I'm going to put up the character arc because we're going to, and I'll tell you what I'm doing when I'm looking at, hold on, did I get that up there?
Yeah, I can see it.
Yeah, we got it. Dude.
Hold on. something's not, I just want to make sure I've got the right thing coming up here. Share screen. There we go. Now I can tell for sure that it's working. Okay, so now I'll tell you, when I was looking at everyone's, or both of your hero's journey arcs, like first thing to keep in mind, like I was impressed because I think both of you are getting it for sure, right? And I've been in a number of these where some people definitely aren't getting it. And it always is a little frustrating. Like, I don't know how else to explain it, but you're both getting it for sure. And what I'm focusing on here with each of yours is how can we just further kind of polish up where we're headed with this, right? How can we further, like, I definitely don't want to just cram you completely into the 12-step hero's journey. But I think what you'll see often is that where you're feeling like, oh, I don't know if this is quite working out, or something doesn't feel like it's quite landing into place, I think what you'll see is that a lot of those issues can be addressed by going back to the 12 steps and polishing up or pushing something a little closer to what that standard kind of format is, right? And you'll get what I mean as we go through this. So let's take a look at Stone Cold Morning. And I like how you broke this out, Gail, between what, and I like what both of you did for sure. You both had a great, you made it very easy to follow where we're at here. And it's not just for my sake that it's worth doing this, but if you can easily follow how you've broken this out, you as the writer as well will more easily be able to do surgery where necessary on the story. It's people that I see end up having the most problems in these areas just have this giant blob of text that, like, you can't tell one kind of step from the other, or like where the actual structure is. It's always difficult for anyone, writer and mentor included, to kind of to figure out where the issues are if it's all over the place. Okay, so Stone Cold Morning. I know you identified a couple of things that you were worried about kind of in your email. Can you address that just kind of briefly here, Gail? Like, there were certain things that you were not quite sure.
Yeah, I think I'm struggling with the outer plot. I'm trying to make it not just plot and have it some story too. But I'm thinking the plot is getting kind of convoluted because I'm so focused on her inner journey. Mm-hmm. And because her inner journey is she really wants to get her daughter back. But then she's got the outer journey of trying to prove herself right and save this guy's life. And in saving the man's life, she kind of gets her own self-respect back and gets her daughter's love again.
Yep. Okay.
So I'm having trouble making it less convoluted.
Gotcha. Okay. So I'll try to help out with this as best I can. And, I'll point out, individual steps that I see here, and then an overall kind of trajectory, maybe to kind of look at. One thing to keep in mind, or maybe two things to keep in mind in general here, is one is that for whatever you can do, especially in a movie like this, where, what am I trying to say here? The inner and the outer journey have to be very, very kind of connected and building off one another, right? So whatever she's going through in the outer journey should be testing the stuff that she's dealing with as part of her inner journey. And the character grows as a result of these events that they're kind of going through. So that's kind of the first thing. It's like all of these things should feel like they are pulling off of one another. And the reason she's able to, she is or she isn't able to deal with certain outer problems is due to how she is dealing with her inner problems. Like, they should be very nicely kind of braided together and intertwined. The other thing that I think would be quite helpful in how you're building this, from what I can see here, is think about what we were talking about a little earlier today, where when we were talking through Glow, right? When we were talking through Glow, we were talking about how each one of these steps has to build on the previous one and has to set the foundation for the next thing. And they all have to be very connected to this through line, the through line being that goal that the character is trying to pursue, the object of desire that the character needs. Like it all like think of it as, I always struggle with figuring out the best example for this, but one that I've used in the past is like, you know, like a Yule tree or like a holiday tree or like a Christmas tree, right? That has like ornaments on it, right? You know what I'm talking about, right? So think of each one of the steps in your story, each one of the scenes in your story, sequences, whatever it is, exchanges of dialogue. Each one of those is an ornament, right? An ornament that you might put on a tree. But those ornaments only work if they're all like hanging from this very interconnected tree that has a very strong trunk that's all leading towards the same sort of goal, right? If you don't have that, then you have a bunch of ornaments that are just kind of lying on the floor, right? So I think what we need to figure out how to do here on some of this is make sure that the central through line of your story is something that we feel even more, you know? And everything in here has to tie into that central through line, like ribs kind of connecting into a spinal cord, right? And they have to build one step to the next. So like we were saying with regards to Glow, or earlier when we were doing with the character arc, when the character gets increased awareness or the call to adventure, the reluctance to change refers to the increased awareness. They are reluctant to take on this call to adventure. They are reluctant to change or to reach this awareness about themselves. And the thing that they are overcoming is their reluctance to take on this change that is being asked for here, right? And when they commit, that's because they've overcome this reluctance to change. And the thing they're committing to is this thing that the increased awareness, the call to adventure, was calling them towards. They are all deeply interconnected. And I think one of the things I'm kind of seeing happen a little bit here is some of these things aren't connected to one another as strongly as they should be. Like they should all be referring to this line that we're going towards to try to reach mastery, try to reach the goal, the object of desire by the end, right? So let's kind of take this step by step through the different, the different journey steps that you have going on here. So in your ordinary world, right, you've got Joanna Cruz, who's an alcoholic, who's lost her son to leukemia, unfaithful husband. Okay, what I want to be clear about in the ordinary world section is, and all of you should keep this in mind, the difference between backstory for a character and how we reveal who the character actually is through events that they respond to. Like we talked about this a little bit earlier, Gail, right? Where we can learn that someone has gone through this, or they think that they would act this way in this situation. They can tell us this thing about themselves, or other people can tell us about them. But we don't really get to know the character until we see how they react to events that are right in front of them. So I'd encourage you to think a bit more on this ordinary world section as how do we reveal how this character usually acts in the normal world. Like what you've done here is you're giving us a lot of theoretical, conceptual, like here's the kind of things that she should be working through, here's what it is. But now we need to take the abstract and make it more concrete. And we make it more concrete by giving specific events that this character is creating or has to respond to, right?
I'm sorry. The first one, I did it that way because she's in court. That's where we open. So all of that comes in. It's this court case where she's losing her daughter. So
okay, well, see, that right there is an important thing to start putting it, because I can only read what I see on the page here, right? And so conceptually, let's be clear, like on the conceptual abstract level, you're hitting all these points. But we need, if we're going to really get the plot working and to get these outer events working, that's where we need to turn them into real concrete, like what is actually happening in this scene? What are these characters doing here? You know, that's how the characters are going to reveal themselves. That's how we're going to really learn all this stuff about, this person was an alcoholic, this, the son died from leukemia. That's only going to come through characters revealing themselves somehow. So the next thing that I think you want to keep in mind in this ordinary world section is also something we talked about today. In the ordinary world section, the characters should have a goal at the beginning, right? Just like Dorothy wants to get out of Kansas. Luke wants to get off of this farm. Alison Brie's character in Glow wants to, she wants to get an acting job. She's been pursuing this forever. Like the character is animated by a goal, and that's something I couldn't yet quite sense here from the stuff that I was reading, is what is this goal that she has that is probably unachievable, given where she's at in her life. Because a lot of us are just kind of treading water out there in life. We have these big goals that we want, but certain things about what we're doing hold us back from them, right? But these goals help us get up in the morning. They make us care about living. They make us care about pushing forward. That's going to help make this character feel like a real three-dimensional person that is not just reacting to the plot events, right? So that's something I want to encourage you to pull out of and start talking about in your sort of outline here. So I think the call to adventure works, like the call to adventure is certainly something that's an inciting incident that throws her world out of balance. So I think that works quite well. I don't have many comments on that area. In the refusal of the call section, I just want to make sure, you say Joanna chooses to accept it was an alcoholic blackout, rock bottom, blah, blah, blah. And sorry, I don't mean to blah, blah, blah you, but I don't need to read the entire thing out loud for everybody. So I want to make sure that in this section, we are putting Joanna into a real and tense situation in which she is directly confronted with the choice, whether or not to kind of speak up and say something to someone, and that should be one of these tense moments where, what is she going to do? I don't know what she's going to do. The audience is kind of on the edge of their seat wondering how is this actually going to turn out? What is she going to, maybe in other instances, even we have seen her maybe do two things. Like sometimes she's very honest and says exactly what's on her mind. But then in other instances, before this refusal of the call, we see that, she is willing to stick her head in the sand at times about things. Because what you then are able to do, if we've set up those two dynamics in her, then the refusal of the call presents her with a situation where both those dynamics are put in direct opposition to one another. And we don't know which direction she's going to take. And that's another just kind of tip there for all of you to make your characters feel very interesting to watch. Give them conflicting character traits, right? And when you put them in certain situations, put them in situations where both those conflicting traits are put at odds with one another. Like say a character is very honest, and they believe in honesty to a fault, honesty above all else, but then they also believe that protecting your family at all costs is just as important. So if you've got a character with both those traits, they don't need to be in conflict with one another. And many people can live through a lot of their lives without them being in conflict. But then you create a situation in which maybe the character's family member is responsible for a murder that our character knows about. And so it makes both of those dynamics within them, protecting family at all costs and being honest at all costs, in direct conflict with one another. And there is no easy choice to be made. And that makes us pay attention. What are they going to do? How are they going to resolve this? So yeah. And then in the reluctance to change thing here, you say she blames her in-laws for turning her daughter against her. So one of the things you've identified about this character is that she blames other people. She acts out in anger. What I want to encourage you to do is, how does her blaming and acting out in this way, how does it in general lead to the call or the inciting incident in the previous section? Like, that's another thing that you can do to make this feel, even this story feel more interconnected, is how is my character, how is my protagonist ultimately responsible for almost all of this happening? You know, like every time that we've got a character where it's like the outside world is the only source of the problems, it feels a little hollow. It feels like the character is just being animated by events outside of themselves. But the more that you can make it that, like, no, she is, even if she doesn't realize it yet, and maybe the audience is not able to fully grasp it yet, plant all the seeds for why she is behind it all, why she is the one who is ultimately to blame for all of this stuff that seems to be befalling her, right? Like if she did something slightly different, then maybe things would be, maybe things would turn out differently, right? We got to be mean to our characters, right? And part of that meanness is making it just impossible for them to get what they want by their inner conflicts, you know? This is where you guys get to be sadists with your characters, you know, very mean people to them. So meeting the mentor, right? Let's go to the meeting the mentor section. I had made a note regarding where, they try to help her change, meaning her therapist and her sister, right? So I think let's also, one thing that should be happening here is they should also be getting Joanna to overcome whatever is holding her back from crossing the threshold. Remember, crossing the threshold should be the moment where this character takes on the mission of the inciting incident, right? This is where, okay, someone's knocked on the door, says, hey, you're going to have to come out and deal with this problem. When they cross the threshold, they open the door to go and take on that problem, right? So the mentor helps them overcome their fear, overcome their anxieties about going out to do this, overcoming the reluctance. So Joanna, her therapist, and her sister should be getting her to overcome whatever it is that's holding her back from taking on that mission, right? And really, what is she holding on to that makes her unwilling to take on that mission of sort of walking out that door? That's something where this is where I was starting to see that, or feel that not all of these steps were deeply interconnected to one kind of spine that was pulling us all the way through. That's where it was starting to feel a little disconnected. So, and we'll get to like where I think this ultimately can really all kind of tie together. So overcoming her fear, be careful about letting her overcome too much here. Don't let her overcome too much of this stuff here. This overcoming should be specifically about overcoming the reluctance to change, right? Before she is willing to change, it's before she's willing to change to what she ultimately commits to. Each one of these things, one builds upon the next. They all interrelate and refer to one another. Crossing a threshold. So in this section, I was looking at, and what I often do in these diagrams that people get back to me is I'll look at the action verbs and who is committing the action verbs, right? So if we look at crossing the threshold, what's happening here, the big thing that's happening here is the person she killed is identified as the shooter in a mass school shooting. Like that's the big thing that happens. And then you say, now Joanna knows. So what I'm seeing here is this doesn't feel yet to me like Joanna is responsible for making a choice to cross a threshold into adventure. Someone else has identified something that she comes to realize something about. But it doesn't yet feel like she has made a choice to take on some inciting incident thing, That's something we have to sort out, I think, a little bit more. And just know, like, look at all the action verbs in all these sections that you have and ask yourself who is committing those actions. If it's not Joanna, that means Joanna isn't in the driver's seat of that scene because she is reacting to what other people are doing. You know, how is she the person that's kind of pushing this sort of thing along? So I saw that also in the committing thing. You say Joanna finishes detox and accepts. So the action verb finishes and accepts, right? So in this committing section, though, what I'm wondering is, what is she committing to doing? What is she committed to doing in this section? What is this, you know, she's finished detox and accepted that she's responsible. But what does this mean she's setting off to do, right? Like when Alison Brie's character walks into that gym, she has committed to trying on this weird audition thing, this weird new job. When Dorothy starts walking on the yellow brick road, she's committing to going out on her own with Toto to go out and find the wizard, right? You know, like, what have they committed to doing? This is where I really couldn't yet feel what is the through line of the story. What is the goal she is consciously out there trying to bring together, you know? So let's see here. Tests, allies, and enemies, right? Here's where I was kind of, I also felt it was maybe getting a little off course, is you say that they are struggling, or they struggle through the 28-day program. You know, I thought when I was reading this that, oh, okay, here's the goal that they're going out to do. They're going to complete this 28-day program. But then it turns out right after that, that's not the overall goal. That's just like a stop along the way, like a rest stop kind of on the journey. So that's where I was starting to feel like, okay, what are they trying to do here? What is the goal that she's out there trying to do? Like, she should have this long-term object of desire that she's consciously trying to pursue. And underneath that, there are these unconscious things that's going to help her work through. But what is that thing she's consciously trying to do that she will not get to a resolution on until the very end? You know, like, what is her version of, like, I have to get a acting job? You know, what is her long-term version of, I have to get back to Kansas, you know?
Yeah, I did. I guess I wasn't clear. It's getting her daughter back. It's winning her daughter back.
Okay, so that is something you absolutely have to kind of feed into this a lot more, because to really test that along, like, we can't lose sight of that as we're watching this or as we're reading this, right? Like, she has to be tested. It's like, is she getting closer to her daughter? Is this pushing her away from her daughter? Like, there should be more interactions with the daughter, and she should be screwing up things with her relationship with her daughter throughout all of this, you know, because she can't, if that's the overall object that she's trying to get, then we can't allow her to get it until that last point. But that means that all these other things are just kind of, you know, maybe pushing her back in ways from getting what she wants. But we can't ever lose sight of it, right? And I think if you do that, I think that could go a long way to help tying the feeling of this even more together, right? In preparing, you know, this area, so preparing, approaching the innermost cave, this section and the previous section of tests, allies, and enemies should feel like we are testing her, right? And we're learning more about her and, you know, about the things that are getting progressively more difficult as we lead into this central midpoint confrontation. And I will say that these things didn't yet feel connected to me. And we talked about this earlier, right, in regards to other stories, right? That all-important approach area. It has to feel like we are getting anxiety of, like, oh, how are they going to deal with this thing in the center of the story? What happens if they get into the Death Star? What happens when they go into the Emerald City of Oz and confront the wizard? What happens when she tries out for this audition to wrestle, when they have this first wrestling match? You know, we have to feel that anticipation building for that thing, right? When we look at the ordeal, again, look at the action verbs in this section. And I'm seeing the action verbs in this section show other people doing things. Not that Joanna is in the driver's seat, you know, trying to accomplish something. Like, I see the friend makes the connection and is killed. Her sister and her therapist still don't believe her. You do say she discovers information suspecting Deborah and a group she belongs to are killers with an agenda. But I think we need more for her to, like, really do and be confronting here. And especially if it's about the daughter, this should be, and this is great in the big change. That's where I saw it. Like I even noted right here in the big change section, you say showdown with daughter. Like, let's make that so much more kind of important here. It's like I made the note that I wrote down here for myself was what does this mean, showdown with daughter? I said, this feels like it could be an important cave moment, right? So I think we ultimately are getting on the same page with this. It's just we have to make that more concrete and express throughout this that the daughter is the thing that she's trying to get back, that she's trying to confront, that's her hardest, thing to face, And then I made a note around this area that says she can get attention in a positive way rather than negative. And my note was, I think it needs to be clear from the crossing the threshold moment that to this point, so from the point she crosses the threshold to this point where she can get negative or she can get attention in a positive way, that make it clear that before this moment, she is still using negative means until she reaches this realization. This realization should really be part of the consequences or the reward. Just like Alison Brie, right? Like in Glow, she ends up realizing that what she's been doing is the thing that's making her fail. In the reward, you say her daughter believes her and her story adds. I just made the note that I felt concerned that Joanna keeps getting put into a reactive mode and other people are kind of figuring things out around her. What does Joanna learn, here? What does she realize? What is the reward that she gets? And if the daughter is the overall goal, be very careful about making it such that her daughter believes her in her story at this point, right? Because you may be letting too much steam out of the story if you allow that resolution to come at that point. That's something you want to kind of save as much as you can until that last possible moment. In the resurrection area, and this is really just kind of I have two notes left here on your stuff, is on the resurrection section, this has to be a section where Joanna is in the driver's seat and she commits to making this one last attempt to kind of win the day with the knowledge she's gained. Have you seen the movie The Invisible Man yet? The new Blumhouse?
Not yet.
Okay. I think it's a recent, really good example when we get to this point in the story where the lead character in The Invisible Man makes her attempt. She is in the driver's seat. She is actively going out to do something in a different way finally now, and maybe getting the chance to win the day, or she could fail miserably. That's maybe an example to take a look at here and kind of emulate some of that energy in here, because I didn't yet feel fully that Joanna was in the driver's seat on what she's trying to do. And really, this final attempt in resurrection should be very tied around winning her daughter back too. It's winning the daughter back. It's also this, what she's dealing with in regards to, finding out what's going on about the people that are dying, right? And then in the mastery section, I get that, yes, it's a tragic ending, but she ultimately reached this sort of fulfillment in mastery, right? She understands, she learns right before she dies. So it's kind of like what we have in American Beauty, right? Where they ultimately die, there's a sacrifice that's made, but they almost did it willingly, and it's because they earned the right to do that. So does that make sense? Like, I really think what will make the difference here is making that object of desire more clear throughout and making everything kind of feed into that spine. Like every one of these sections that you have build off of the previous and move into the next one. They all refer back to the mission that she was taking on when she committed. And that mission she was taking on when she committed was the thing that, she got the knock on the door about, And when you can really tie all of those things together, it will feel less like, well, here's something that's coming up, and then here's another thing that's coming up, and then here's another thing. It'll all feel like they're building nicely off of one another.
Right. Yeah. I see what you're saying. It's still a little nebulous right now, but it's starting to come together. If I know that the inner journey is to win her daughter's respect, and then the outer, the plot point is to kind of expose who the killer is, then it might be, now that I know I can say it concisely, then it'll be easier to kind of weave them together.
Yeah, and think too, overall with your theme, is that the outer one is about exposing something, but maybe one of the things that's holding her back throughout so much of this is her unwillingness to expose herself. Right? Because maybe that's one of the things that really keeps her from connecting with her daughter is, you know, she can criticize this cult that's out there all they want about operating in the dark and the shadows, but maybe that's kind of what she's doing too, and why she pushes people away from her.
Which is why she's an alcoholic and she's lost her daughter at the beginning to begin with, which sends her to rehab.
Yep.
So, okay. All right. It's great. Yeah. It's a better jumping off point. Thank you.
And look, all this stuff, it takes time to fine tune this stuff down. It's like, you know, you've got a nice, beautiful block of marble here, and you're just chipping away until you get to that really, you know, that really just impressive and overwhelming picture that you can kind of see in your head. It's going to become more and more clear as you do it. But remember, it's like, okay, you start with the abstract, and maybe that's, and look, different writers approach it in different ways too. Some people come from far more of a concrete place where they can see all the very specific events that they want to have happen in their story, but then they have a really hard time giving them another meaning to it, like a deeper level, a deeper layer. But you, it sounds like, at least with this, you came from the opposite standpoint, which a lot of other writers do. It's like, you know, the themes you want to deal with, the kind of inner journeys that they want to go to. Now you got to take that abstract material and make it more concrete, right? So they come from that one side and try to get here. You come from this side and try to get to this point, you know, and you'll get there. You know, I can see it from what you have to work with, because both of you have done quite well with this assignment so far. I'm actually very impressed with what both of you have done here, because this is often, we don't always get these kind of results, I think, and I want to get these sort of results all the time. Okay, well, thank you, Gail. Marty, so I hope you're well.
Sweet, man.
Hey, whatever. I mean, it's all good. These things happen. Look, I was sick the very first session that we were supposed to have, so we're all delayed. Like this otherwise would have been our fourth and last session today. So things happen. We deal with them. Not an issue. That's why
we're being understanding, man. I appreciate it.
All good, all good. So let's take a look though at the Cornish Witch, and this is another thing where I was getting the feeling, just like what we were talking about with Gail, is, you know, now I can see a lot more things that you have been working with starting to get a bit more concrete, which is good, right? Even when it comes to the title, I felt like this what you'd zeroed in on a cool title for this, right? So let's just kind of, well, first I want to get, you know, how are you feeling about this? How are you feeling about where you're at with this and what's going on at this point?
I actually really enjoyed developing it this week, even though I only had a day to devote to it. But yeah, it seemed to come off the page, so it was a good sign. Like, yeah, and I did a bit. I watched the pilots. I watched Breaking Bad. I watched Glow.
Yep.
I didn't have time to bloody send you the breakdowns, but I thought about them. I watched them after writing this, because I literally had to write the bloody thing. I had one day spare from the shoot I'm still on. And
did you find that informative at all? Did you see the structures kind of, you know, coming to the surface in those?
Well, yeah, I did, but it's like Glow. It all seems to happen. I mean, you guys obviously discussed it. It happens very much towards the back end. That was my impression.
Okay.
Virtually everything. I don't know whether that's your analysis of it. Whereas with Breaking Bad, there's a little bit more subtlety to it in some respects. But I've written it out. But yeah, it just, and then I watched like half of Casablanca. And things are very clear in Casablanca, I think, apart from the big change. That's until you talked about it. I mean, but that, yeah. So I did a bit of analysis. I wrote this. I enjoyed writing it. It was a pretty good week, really.
Yeah.
Felt creative.
Good. And I mean, keep in mind too that like we're talking about you know, when we look at these diagrams and we look at the archetypical kind of structures and stuff, like, yeah, we're talking about something that feels very static. But then when you see it out in the wild, right, like you see it put into use in the real world, there are going to be little tweaks to it. There are going to be things that people are, you know, introducing that are feel a little off course, but for good reason for the story. So always feel free to kind of reinvent things a little bit more if they do end up working. You know, so you'll just see all the different slight remixes of these things that are out there.
For both stories, I think they're very similar in terms of they're both thematically about empowerment.
Yeah.
And I really love that about both.
And that's something too, like when you think
they
about,
do it so brilliantly.
Yeah, when you think about what themes is your story dealing with, or a story dealing with, something like empowerment is very accessible to people, right? Because who doesn't like feeling empowered? You know, that's an aspirational kind of emotion or feeling for just about everyone in the world. So it makes those things very easy to get into, right? So that's something to think about for all of you when you're writing your stories. If you really want things to resonate, think of that overall sort of, you know, universal emotion or theme that you're tapping into. And that's kind of one of the last things that we were talking about with Gail today, right? Was like, how can you tie all this together with a theme that like really resonates or lands? Well, it sounds like maybe one of the areas to explore with hers is the, you know, keeping secrets yourself and, you know, fighting against secrets that are being kept out there, out in the bigger world. And maybe, you know, maybe we don't always have the right to uncover other people's secrets if we can't even, you know, reveal our own, right? Yeah, and we all have that. We all have secrets, so it's something all of us can understand and appreciate, right? So that's how we make these stories accessible to people, is it's not just this very obscure idea that we're dealing with, or this obscure world. It's how do we open that up so that everyone can relate to it, or that most everyone who is human can relate to it that's watching it, right? Okay, so let's speak of some inhuman characters, right? For the Cornish witch, and I'll just take you through kind of step by step, like I did with Gail, what my reactions were as I was kind of reading through this. Okay, so and to be clear, I want to make it very clear to both of you. I think you both did a fantastic job with this assignment, and I'm excited to see what else we have going on here, because you both are, like I said, I think you both are getting it. You know, and that's so important. I know it should be obvious, but like a lot of people don't. All right, so Tattie's Ordinary World. Tattie is our protagonist, right? So you say Tattie's Ordinary World includes the magical world. All right, so when you end up writing this and when you develop this further, I want to encourage you to make sure that the introduction of the magical world is also accompanied a little bit by some logical disbelief, right? Like to help, because what you want to do anytime you're introducing like an unusual world or a magical world or a science fiction world is you have to ease us as the new audience, you ease us into this shallow end of the pool before throwing us into the deep end of the pool. If you immediately throw us into like, here's magic all over the place and blah, 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 with this, it's like, it can be a little bit jarring at first, especially if you've got something that combines the ordinary world with kind of the magical world, you know? Like for the most part, your characters, when they are faced with the supernatural, at first, they should initially be kind of skeptical and disbelieving before they're won over. And the reason you want to do that is they act as the audience's surrogates, right? So if a character that we see is, grounded, logical, and real and authentic, if we see them coming to accept magic and we go through the steps with them where they don't believe at first, and then they see undeniable proof, and then, you know, they're a little wary of it, but they're going to go along with it, and then they just fully believe it after those steps, then we feel that way as well. It's similar to, think of like a Han Solo character in Star Wars. Han Solo character, perfect example, right, of someone who's very kind of, you know,
grounded kind of dude.
Yeah, a grounded character
like,
who is sarcastic, who makes fun of things and stuff like that. If that character can accept all this crazy shit that's going on, then the most sarcastic in the audience can accept it and move on with it, you know? Like, let certain characters kind of voice those.
Nice point.
What's that?
Thanks, man. I think that's a really nice point. Thank you, dude. Appreciate it.
Okay, so limited awareness of problem then. So I think this is good what you're doing here, and I just want to encourage you to make sure that you're creating events that reveal these things about her, that she can't trust anyone, that she can't trust her mother. Like, these things that you're talking about, just like what we talked about with Gail, is like, how do we turn this into concrete events that are happening that allow the character to reveal these traits about herself? That's kind of the next step to start building into. Okay, so
I definitely.
What's that?
I felt. Sorry, Chris. I felt when I was writing it, that was the weakness. Definitely, I didn't have time to really think. You know, to make that drive the story as much as it could do. Definitely.
Well, you'll get there, and you've got you know, in an abstract way where you're going to go with it. And I think having it's you've got your map now. Now let's you know what the territory looks like. Now you draw on the specifics of your map, you know, so that it's just step by step. You'll get to that more concrete part. In the inciting incident, the call to adventure, you know, you say Taddy discovers the remains. Well, you had a question here. It was like, it seems like either Taddy discovers the remains or someone else, or it's found by someone.
Yeah, exactly.
My recommendation is keep Taddy in the active role, right? Yes. Like just like what we were talking about with Gail, look at the action verbs in your scenes, in the sections that you're writing out, and ask yourself, who is committing these actions? And you want your character to be the one committing most of these actions. You want them to be the driving force behind what's happening here. So that's what I would recommend on that point. Okay, so
thanks,
then you've got like Taddy realizes and her increased awareness, and you say might be able to help the mermaid and wants to, but how to, okay. So in this area, this is where I want to encourage you to dig in a little deeper, right? Is why does she want to help this mermaid, right? This is where you want to avoid her feeling like she's just a delivery vehicle for what needs to happen in the story. Like, why does she feel a connection to this creature? You know, like, why does she care? You know, and I want to encourage you to think, and I'll mention this a little later, is like, you don't want it to just be like, oh, she's attracted to this person. Like, what else? Like, does she feel like they?
It's like the identification thing.
What's that?
So, my idea is, which it doesn't come through in this, but is, you know, the theme. I need to bring out the theme here, which is basically they're both lonely. The mermaid.
There you go. There you go. So we need to see in a concrete way how she sees that this creature is lonely, right? And if she sees this creature as lonely, then I understand, okay, she feels a connection to this thing. And maybe there's something, they have some moment or something like that. You know, it doesn't fully play out yet, but it's like, but you feel the promise that maybe they can connect, maybe they both can like overcome their loneliness with something like that. But I just want to make sure that, yeah, just make it clear that, you know, she's not just doing this because the story needs her to, but it's because she has a specific reason to want to, right? So similar thing to kind of, you know, let's create events that, illustrate this is the refusal of the call area, where you say Taddy is scared of her powers and revealing them. Make sure you end up creating events that illustrate the specifics of this. Same sort of thing with like, you know, in Reluctance to Change, where you say, who can Taddy trust? You know, give us situations where she is given the choice, of whether or not to reveal what she knows, right? So put her in situations where, you know, okay, she has this fantastical information that she's seen this thing, like someone's calling out, like, does anyone know about this? So, like, that's a very obvious, stupid way, but like she is put in the hot seat in some scene where it's like, okay, she could say the truth, she could say what she knows, or maybe she doesn't because, you know, but because that's ultimately she hides these things or whatever. But put her in specific situations where that is tested. Number 5, crossing the threshold. You say she vows to help save Serena. Just make sure that, you know, when she's making this vow to help save Serena, that that this goes back to the reason that she feels that particular personal connection to this mermaid, right? The loneliness thing. So, okay, she's vowing to go help, like Harry recounts this sad story, and then, you know, Taddy is like, I'm going to go save her, but make it clear that, you know, whatever it is that gets her to go cross this threshold, it comes back to the reason she felt that connection to the creature. So if it's that loneliness, then this sad story should really trigger something in her that the audience is able to immediately understand. You know, like maybe there's something about Cyrena's sad story that very closely parallels what Taddy has gone through herself. And if the audience already knows what Taddy has gone through, then we immediately understand, oh, that's why she's going to go save this creature, you know? In the tests, allies, and enemies section, you have Taddy, you know, she confides in Coco and Hendrix, her new school friends, that she's a witch. Okay, so for this event, I want to encourage you to make this very difficult and kind of cringy to do, you know? And maybe it's even something that in this section, it takes some time to convince them. Like maybe it's not just one conversation. She's like, oh, hey guys, I'm a witch. It's like, you know, she has to broach a subject with them. They're not willing to believe it. You know, she has to do something to prove herself and like tease it out a bit more so that this is something she really has to earn. You know, when she does get what she wants, ultimately, it'll make it that much more satisfying to see her get what she wants, you know? And then you say Coco and Hendrix, you have Coco and Hendrix admitting that they both see the magical world. Make sure we're not making this too easy. What?
Same thing. It needs to be over time.
Yeah, it has to be something, and maybe they're not even willing to admit it yet. Maybe that's something that happens in future episodes or something. We see that a lot in like, I don't know, like Sabrina the Teenage Witch. At first, she's like hiding her witch powers from her friends at her mortal school. And then over time, we come to realize every single possible person in this world that she exists in is somehow connected to magic, even as mundane as they may be. So it's like, but it doesn't happen all at once. It's something that they have to earn. But let's be clear, I don't generally recommend using Sabrina as an example of great writing because it's a mess.
I'm not going to. I won't be watching it, don't worry. I have seen enough of it.
Oh yeah, if you've seen any of it, you've seen more than enough of it, I'm sure. So then you have Cassandra Maugan. And how do you pronounce that? Cassandra, how do you pronounce that last name?
Morgan.
What's that?
Morgan.
Morgan?
As in M-O-R-G-A, and the same as Morgan.
Okay, Morgan. Okay, all right. Cool. So this thing that's happening here, I'm wondering if maybe it's worth making Cassandra initially a friend that kind of shapeshifts and turns into someone who's a betrayer. You know, maybe you can get more drama out of that where, okay, so Coco and Hendrix end up being okay with Taddy saying she's a witch, but maybe for some reason Cassandra, that kind of creates a rift between them or something, you know? Like maybe there's just more dynamics to get out of a relationship between the two of them, you know? Just a thought, you know?
No, I like it, man. I hear you.
And just something to think about maybe. So in the preparing for the big change section, and note that if I'm not commenting on certain sections, it's because I don't really have too many notes on some of the other sections, right? So in preparing for the big change, you say, she trusts Irina not to kill her too. Okay. Or you have that as a question. So my note to this was like, maybe we can balance the fear of this mermaid with the attraction that, you know, she's starting to feel for this mermaid. Maybe Tatty initially goes after the mermaid for different reasons, you know, telling herself on the surface, you know, she's going to go find this mermaid for some reason, but then in the cave, the truth of the attraction kind of reveals itself. You know, like sometimes we'll go out and try to do something because we tell ourselves we want it for some reason, but ultimately we're doing it for other reasons altogether that we're not willing to admit to ourselves. You know, it's the same thing with like, I don't know, for some reason I'm thinking to like, you know, little boys in like kindergarten or first grade who will be very mean to like little girls, right? And they'll tell them, oh, I don't like girls, or I don't like you. But the whole reason that they're doing that is because they like the girl, you know? Like they're doing, the thing that they're doing on the surface is not why they're actually doing it, because they haven't fully realized it yet. You know, so maybe that's a dynamic that's worth kind of playing with there, is that Tatty's going out there for certain reasons, she thinks, but then when she is confronted with the mermaid, she has a whole new appreciation for, wait, this is really why I'm out here doing this.
Quick, give me one sec. I just need to tell
Oh,
someone
yeah.
something. Give me one sec.
All good.
Chris, can I ask real quick, what's the homework for next week? Because I might have to jump off in a few minutes.
Yeah, so homework for next week, watch Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, at least the first 15 minutes. Look for the gap in progression. If you're watching the entire movie, also look for the other concepts that we talked about previously. When it comes to your material, you know, deal with the notes that we've been talking about today. Make things more concrete. Both of you, like, make things more concrete and address some of the notes that we've been talking about, and also start factoring in the concept of the gap and progression into your work, right? Like this is where you'll start, like, you know, what are the conflicts and frustrations that you're introducing to push the character back from the things that they're trying to do. It's like, it's that sort of thing, right?
Got it.
Okay. So Marty, so, you know, maybe you'll see what I mean is, I think, as far as like, maybe she goes out there for certain reasons, but then realizes, oh, I'm really being drawn towards her because I'm attracted to her, or whatever it may be. Okay.
That was definitely my idea overall. It's kind of like a turning point for the.
Great. Perfect. So in Tatty's ordeal, this is a kind of logistic kind of production note. You say she swims through the ancient pirate galleon and enters Serena's coral cave. This is cool and cinematic. It's such a cool cinematic thing that's happening here. But I encourage you to just keep budget concerns in mind when creating certain scenes like this, right? Because cool. These, you know, maybe like as cool as, you know, a huge ancient pirate galleon and there's this coral cave, maybe I could see, you know, someone looking at budgetary concerns being like, can't we just make it a cave that she goes into, you know? Like it's just be careful about those things, you know? Let me see here. And I just have a couple more notes. So,
I mean, she could live in the pirate ship, because it would still have that same symbolic value, wouldn't it? It's like, you know, inside, and then she could still have her home in the pirate's galleon.
For sure.
Maybe, instead of the cave. Either one.
I guess all I mean is, like, you know, just keep in mind as you build this out, like, it's, you know, especially if you're dealing with a magical world, like how can we make this producible, you know? And that's just one kind of thing where I was like, okay, let's make sure you know to kind of pull yourself back at times, you know?
Thanks, man. I appreciate that.
So, when we're talking, like right before section 9, so you say Taddy's big change, you say even Serena, her potential mortal enemy. I will say that until you mentioned right here that Serena is her potential mortal enemy, I didn't yet feel like that fear of this mermaid or the mortal enemy thing was kind of an element until that point. So if that's something you want to play with more, I'd encourage you to put that earlier as a dynamic in this.
Yeah.
So that when we reach this point, we really anticipate that, oh my God, this could be such a, scary kind of crazy thing that she's doing. Taddy's reward. What's that?
That the mermaid, because it's pretty clear the mermaid's probably been eating these sailors, so she's not sure whether she would potentially eat her instead.
Then I guess just make
like that. So I do need.
Then I guess just make sure that Taddy along the way is expressing some of that fear, or that we feel some of that fear with her. Don't take it as an implicit. Like, make sure that the audience is like, aware that this is a big thing that she's about to go do, and she might lose her life, and
that's cool.
that may be the case. And then we'll feel that like sort of mortal enemy kind of fearful kind of thing there, right? Okay, so section 9, Taddy's reward, kind of seizing the sword. You say Taddy impresses upon Serena that they have to escape from a coral cave. All right, so this is just where I want to encourage you to be very concrete here. How does she do this, right? And the previous section, so the big change section right before, section 8, that should be the darkest, scariest kind of true brush with death moment, right? And it should be clear to us that in that section 8, she fails somehow. She fails at doing something. Like if we're thinking of Glow, right? What does she fail with? Alison Brie fails to make that audition work, and she basically, goes through a metaphorical death of her dreams, right? So how does Taddy we should make sure that you're building that sort of feeling into that big change moment, right? And then the last note is really kind of a suggestion here, right? And I felt this, and maybe it's just something to think about. You may not want to do this, but I just want to throw it out there. So if I go to page 5 in your thing, right before rededication to change, and you talk about, they're chased by the fishermen and the surfer posse along the coast. Serena falls into their trap, swims into a great fishing net. They haul her onto the fishing boat, bring her to the cove, and hand her over to Medea and Cassandra. Okay. So my thought here, and I'm just kind of spitballing here, you don't have to want to go along with this. I'm just raising it as another possibility, is I was thinking, what if instead of what we have going on here right now, what if Taddy's inability to trust leads directly to Serena being caught, just as Taddy learns that Serena is not such a bad person after all, right? Then, if that were to happen, then maybe Taddy could take the spell book herself as a reward, and then the remaining sections of the story are about her having to save this newfound love interest. It's maybe, I'm thinking, how can we maybe make Taddy more responsible for Serena being caught, and have it tied
really nice
into Taddy's ability
to. Really nice.
What's that?
I love it. It's a really lovely dramatic complication, and I like it.
Okay.
I'll give it a go. See,
well, think about it. And you may ultimately, there are reasons why it doesn't work. That's just me kind of spitballing, throwing it out there as a possible suggestion. And you may even come up with, if you do end up using it, maybe you'll come up with even better complications within that or something like that. But I just think there's something that, all of this again goes back to, like I've kind of encouraged both of you to do, is make your character responsible for what's happening. Make sure your character's in the driver's seat with this stuff. And that's really the majority of what I had here for you. I hope that's helpful. If you have any last kind of question here, happy to answer, but I think you both are doing quite well with this, and I look forward to seeing what we have for next week.
Chris, that was fantastic. Much appreciated. Great notes, man. And sorry about the circumstances.
No problem. And great, really, seriously, great work from both of you. You both are actually, you know, you're not fighting these ideas we're throwing out there. You're embracing them and you're trying them on, which is exactly what I encourage people to do here. And, you know, you're grasping the concepts too. And I see you're actually doing the work, which is amazing. So thank you for doing that.
I enjoy it, Chris. And I really value your help, man. Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, it definitely, it does feel it's coming together, especially like you said, I'm working thematically first and then constructing the plot. So I'm really grateful for that. Thank you.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, good work, both of you. You have the assignments for next week, and, you know, please let's keep on going the way we have been. Get me the material in time. And now, you know, the timing is slightly different if you're outside the US, but we'll be fine.
I won't fuck up next week. Yeah. I'll be at home next week, definitely.
Great. All right. Well,
have a good week, guys.
See you next week.
See each other again next week.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Ciao. Ciao.